The Bucs definitely got the better of the Jets during joint practices, but injuries are beginning to crop up for the Buccaneers, and some of them may become concerning sooner rather than later.
You are Locked On Buccaneers, your daily Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up and welcome into the Locked On Bucs podcast. I'm your host, James Yarcho, and today's episode is brought to you by Kalshi. For a limited time, download the Kalshi app and use code Locked On to get $10 when you trade $10. We are going to be talking about Todd Bowles' comments about those joint practices in New Jersey, as well as a couple of mailbag questions about the first game coming up in a little bit. But I wanted to start with some of these injuries that happened over the last couple of days, because one of them in particular might become a concern down the line. Now, Jalen McMillan and Tez Johnson didn't participate. That's fine. We kind of knew that. Neither did Benjamin Morrison as far as team drills were concerned. I talked about that on the last episode, although I thought it was a little strange that on social media it was such a big deal that was made out of him like warming up and going through individual drills, because he did that a couple of times last week. I made note of that. You also had Tristan Wirfs and Vita Vea not participating. Nothing new there. The first surprise was Zion McCollum sitting out both practices, and Todd Bowles was asked about it, and he said, quote, "No more update. He's just healing. He's doing a lot better. We'll see when he comes out." Now, I'm not sure what there is to update. I obviously missed some things that happened on Sunday when I was driving back from Tampa to Ohio, and so it could have gotten lost in the shuffle. But as far as I knew, he participated on Sunday, and then the team left for the joint practices on Monday. So I'm not sure what's really going on there. I wasn't able to find much, but that was kind of the first issue that set off alarms for me. But then you had Elijah Simmons get rolled on and leave with the trainers for a lower body injury. That's a little concerning considering he's expected to be a big part of the depth for the interior defensive line. You had Jake Browning leave practice on Tuesday with a lower back injury. He did not participate on Wednesday. Bowles was asked about whether or not he decided who would be starting at quarterback in Friday's game, and he said, quote, "Not yet. I mean, Jake is not ruled out either. So he's getting treatment, and we're going to see where he's at the next 2 days as well. If not, I'm sure Connor Bazelak will start the game," end quote. Then you have the big one. Emeka Egbuka got rolled up on, and he limped off the field towards the end of practice on Wednesday. Bucky Irving was on NFL Network. He was asked about that injury by Mike Garafolo, and Bucky said that he believed Egbuka was fine after watching him move around on the sideline, walk off the field without much of a problem. As for Todd Bowles, he said, quote, "I don't know the status of that right now because I was on the other field, but I'll check in with that as soon as I go in. I didn't see it. They haven't gotten it to me yet," end quote. It was reported later in the day on Wednesday that Egbuka had suffered a toe sprain, and the team wouldn't know the severity until after imaging results came back. As of this recording, those results have not been announced yet. Basically, this could be another way of saying he has a mild case of turf toe. That's where my concern really comes in. Now, a toe sprain is considered a mild stretching or tearing of any toe ligament. Turf toe strictly affects the big toe's main joint. That is caused when a person's foot is flat and then forcibly bent back, which could have happened based on him being rolled on. If you're the Bucs, you are rooting strictly for the toe sprain. It's an easier and quicker recovery. You ice it, you rest it, you're back to normal over the course of a few days to a week. If it's turf toe, that's going to be a problem. Prolonged rest, icing, compression, elevation, sometimes a walking boot is needed. The recovery time is a few weeks to several months, depending on the severity. You saw Joe Burrow miss a ton of time last year with turf toe that required surgery. So one thing that I'm going to make sure that I look for during Friday's game on the sideline is whether or not Egbuka is in a boot. If he isn't, great. It's probably not a long-term problem. He'll be back well before week 1. If he is in a boot, I think the Bucs have a problem on their hands. I know we have talked about how talented and deep this receiving core is, but Egbuka figures to be the biggest focal point of the offense. We are talking a floor of about 130 to 140 targets as the Z in Robinson's scheme. The entire offense runs through the Z receiver. It was that way in Los Angeles under McVay. It was that way in Atlanta with Drake London under Zach Robinson. It was that way really with the Bucs in 2024 until Godwin went down with the ankle injury. Egbuka is in position to have a massive season because of how much Robinson is going to scheme up plays to get him the ball. So now if he misses extended time, the Bucs have to shift things all over the place again like they had to do last year. And you're talking about what I think are two likely scenarios. Either Ted Hurst gets thrown into the role of X receiver a lot sooner than expected. You move McMillan to the Z and then Godwin stays as your slot guy, or you move Godwin to the Z, you feature him more while you then have a platoon of Tez Johnson, Cam Johnson, and David Sills coming in as the slot receiver to fill in for Chris Godwin. I'm not saying that neither of those options will work, but it's not going to be as strong as it is with Egbuka at Z, Godwin at his normal spot in the slot, and then McMillan on the outside. Egbuka is at his best, number one, against zone coverage. But number two, when he's being moved all over the field pre-snap and Robinson is able to really create an advantage for the receivers and Baker by creating those mismatches between the Bucs receivers and either a linebacker or a safety who wind up being forced into coverage because of that formation. If Egbuka is out, I would also expect a lot more of the pony package. Robinson has split those running backs out wide quite a bit already. So having a two receiver set with Godwin and McMillan while Bucky and Gainwell are on the field, then you can move either of them to the outside or into the slot. That could create a lot of really interesting options for them in the passing game. Both of those running backs can handle the job. Both are huge threats as receivers, especially in the open space. So I could see Robinson kind of leaning in to that style of formation quite a bit early on if Egbuka's injury is more severe than we are all hoping to hear. As far as the injuries go, though, the Bucs have been extremely fortunate so far. You've seen multiple key players just within the NFC South go down to season-ending injuries. In the Saints' case, it's been injuries and an unexpected retirement. So when you look at the Bucs situation with Wirfs and Morrison and Browning and McCollum and McMillan, it seems pretty minor in the grand scheme of things. None of those guys are expected to miss week one of the NFL season. None of them are expected to be serious long-term injuries. So the Bucs, while there seems to be a lot of these issues already in this third week of training camp heading into the first preseason game, they have been fortunate when you look around the league and see some of these big-time contributors on other teams already out for the year. San Fran, I think, was missing like 20 players at practice one time last week because of all of their injuries. Detroit already lost their starting center for a very long period of time. Ricky Pearsall, again, back in San Francisco, he's out for the year. Caleb Proctor in Arizona. So there's a lot worse injury problems than what the Bucs are facing. But the concern with Egbuka is how long this is going to linger and how severe is it actually? Because that will fundamentally change the way the offense is set to operate. And it's certainly going to cause the dynamic at training camp to change. You have a lot of receivers getting a lot of extra work because of some of these guys already being held out. But now all of a sudden you're having to reshape the way that they're being utilized. You have to rework that entire offensive attack plan. It makes me a little nervous. I'm not going to lie, waiting to hear some good news on that front. Todd Bowles talks about how the joint practices went, even though there was basically an entire WWE event that broke out over the course of the last couple of days. That is coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs.
Matt Derry here from the Locked On Lions podcast. Life insurance is one of those things you don't really think about until you have a reason to. For me, it really hit home when my father passed away over 20 years ago. You start thinking less about yourself and more about the people who depend on you and making sure they're taken care of no matter what. That's why I like Ethos. They make getting life insurance simple. It's 100% online, no doctor visits, no needles, none of that. You can get a quote in seconds, apply in just a few minutes, and even get same-day coverage. And honestly, that's huge because life gets busy. You can get up to $3 million in coverage, and some plans are as low as just $30 a month. It's just one of those things that gives you peace of mind knowing your family is protected. Take 10 minutes to get covered today with life insurance through Ethos. Get your free quote at ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. That is ethos.com/LockedOnNFL. Applications may vary. Rates may vary.
Before the season even kicks off, everyone's making predictions. Who wins the division? Who makes the playoffs? Who is lifting the Lombardi Trophy at the end of the season? On Kalshi, America's #1 prediction market platform, you can trade those predictions in a live market. Will the Tampa Bay Buccaneers make the playoffs this season? Right now, they are trading at 42%, meaning that a $100 trade would pay out $228.80 if they make the playoffs. You better believe that I have action there because way too many people are down on the Bucs this year without fully understanding what happened last year. On Kalshi, you're trading against peers in a live market, meaning there is no house. And as the probability changes, you can buy in and out of your position. Trade the draft pick, the game, and more on Kalshi. Download the Kalshi app and use code LOCKEDON to get $10 when you trade $10. KALSHI, Kalshi, trade on anything. 18 and over only. Restrictions and eligibility requirements apply. Event contract trading involves risk and may not be suitable for all investors. Kalshi products are not available in all jurisdictions. Prices, values, and available markets may differ from those mentioned. For more information, see kalshi.com/regulatory. Thank you again for making Locked On Bucs your first listener view every day. And thank you for making Locked On the #1 sports podcast network. Real quick, I am sorry that there was no Wednesday episode. Some nasty storms rolled through here over the course of Tuesday and Wednesday. I ended up losing power for most of the day on Wednesday. That was not my idea of a good time. I couldn't do this show. I was supposed to do the Our Lad show. It became a huge mess. However, there will be a Saturday episode to react to the game, as well as a post-game squad show immediately following the Bucs and Jets live on YouTube. Plenty of stuff still coming your way. Now, let's talk about WrestleMania, or the Bucs and Jets joint practices. We talked about the fights from Tuesday with Evan. 2 more broke out on Wednesday. Todd Bowles ripped into his defense after the first fight. Heading into those practices, Bowles was actually asked how you prevent those kinds of things from happening. And he said, quote, "Well, we always talk about it. That's not what we're going up there for. We're going up there to practice and get better. You get thrown out of games for fights, you'll probably get thrown out of practice for fighting," end quote. Well, that didn't happen. No one got tossed from practice as far as I could gather, based on the 5 fights that transpired over the 2 days. That said, the overall takeaway from those practices was positive. The Bucs unquestionably won both days with the defense shining in both. 3 interceptions off Geno Smith on day 1. Ruben Bain himself with 3 sacks on day 2. The vibes were positive overall, and Bowles talked about it, saying, quote, "The effort is outstanding on both sides. I think we got a lot of work done. The young guys got a chance to play against different guys, a different scheme, so to speak, and they got thrown in there early. There's a lot of tape to correct. There's a lot of things to learn from, but the effort was great. We've just got to clean some things up," end quote. Well, starting center Graham Barton also weighed in on how these practices helped the team, saying, quote, "It's great work because you're getting live looks, different personnel. Throughout camp, you kind of get used to who you're going against. You know their strengths and their weaknesses. They know your strengths and weaknesses. It's hard to always truly evaluate yourselves off of practice against your team. Coming out against a totally different opponent with a different defense, different looks, different flavors, you kind of get to test your mettle. You get to test, one, obviously your physicality, but your communication ability, mentality wise, how you come together, chemistry, how you hit combinations. I think we made a lot of progress this week. These 2 good days of joint practice, I was really impressed with our unit as a whole. I thought we communicated well, having a new offensive coordinator with Zach Robinson. This was kind of the first time we've gone live like this against another team, and there wasn't a whole lot of issues schematically and targeting wise and communication wise. So I was super pumped about that, end quote. I personally am a huge fan of joint practices. Yes, they can get out of hand at times like it did between the Bucs and Jets, but I think it's especially important for players to get looks at other players and other schemes, especially when you aren't going to be playing in the preseason game. Bowles said that Bain isn't likely to play on Friday, so he went out and he got 3 sacks on Wednesday, one of which would have drawn a holding penalty on top of things. Baker got to go against a different defense, a different secondary for 2 days. He isn't playing in the game. Egbuka, Godwin, McMillan were all unlikely to play, even if healthy. So this is a great test for them to get that work and help prepare them for the season. I'm with Evan. If you go back to the last episode, I want to see the starters get some legitimate work in the preseason, most likely next week against the Kansas City Chiefs. The third game is going to likely be more about the bubble players. Honestly, this is what I hate the most about a 17-game regular season. I hate the fact that there's only 3 preseason games. And I know fans want the season to get started faster. They hated the 4 preseason games. Season ticket holders hated paying full price for 2 preseason games, but it was more beneficial, in my opinion, to have 4. You have 1 or 2 drives for the starters in game 1. You have the first quarter, maybe going into the second quarter in game 2. You had the full first half, sometimes into the third quarter for the starters in game 3, and then none of them in game 4. Now, you've gotten to a point where every team treats the preseason differently. So you never really know what you're getting into or how it's going to help you prepare. You take the Bengals, for example, they're going to play their starters in the first preseason game. The Bucs are playing virtually none. The Jets are going to play their starters. Who knows if the Chiefs would play any starters next week when they travel to Tampa. It's all over the place, and it really irks me. Regardless, I think these practices really helped the starters know where they stand at the moment. And then you'll have more joint practices with Jacksonville here in a couple of weeks. That's also going to help. And this is also why you likely won't see any starters in the third preseason game. They're going to get their reps in practice against the other starters. They're guaranteed to be able to do that. And then that'll pretty much be the end of it. I'll get into more players to watch and what to watch on tomorrow's preview show of the first preseason game. But I will say I am really excited to see Jalen Daniels. And if Browning is out, we'll see more of him than we probably normally would have otherwise. He really is a fun quarterback to watch, but I want to see him have the opportunity to showcase that arm a little bit more than I saw when I was at camp. There were a lot of times that he was in and the defense was so stifling that he ended up having to take off and run quite a bit. Even my son was talking to me about it the other day, and he goes, he seems like a running quarterback, and that's really not his game. He has got an absolute cannon for an arm, just hasn't had the opportunity to really showcase it, at least from what I saw during the padded practices last week. So I don't think, that's where he's at his best. And I'm looking forward to him having the opportunity to really show how far along he's come in this offense and what he can do when he actually has the opportunity to set and throw. Hopefully, whatever offensive line is in front of him will give him that opportunity. Couple of mailbag questions to round out the show. That is coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Bucs. There are more live events than ever worth seeing right now. Games, concerts, comedy shows, festivals. The hard part usually isn't deciding what you want to attend. It's actually getting the tickets. Between long wait times, confusing checkout processes, and surprise fees, buying tickets can sometimes feel way harder than it should. That's why so many fans are turning to Game Time. The app is built to make buying tickets simple with upfront pricing, seat views before you buy, and exclusive savings opportunities that help you get to the events that you want without the usual hassle. You guys know I like to take my sons to lots of concerts, lots of games. I just used Game Time to get tickets to take my son to go see the Lightning and the Blue Jackets in Columbus in November, and the process could not have been easier. I picked the tickets, I double click on my phone, boom, that was it, done. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets to every type of event with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKED ON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Support for today's episode comes from Indeed Sponsored Jobs. When workplace chaos hits and you need the right hire, Indeed Sponsored Jobs helps connect employers with candidates who match specific needs like skills, certifications, and location, so less time gets spent searching and more time gets spent finding the right fit. People are finding quality hires on Indeed right now. In the minute I've been talking to you, companies like yours have made 27 hires on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. Everyone knows that hiring the right person is vital to the success of a company. You don't want to go through the process just to realize they're not the right fit, and now you got to start from scratch. Indeed Sponsored Jobs cuts through all of the candidates to narrow down the type of people that are exactly who you're looking for. So spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Less stress, less time, more results. When you need the right person to cut through the chaos, this is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job the premium status it deserves at Indeed.com/podcast. Just go to Indeed.com/podcast right now. Support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs. Wrapping things up here on today's episode of Locked On Bucs, and we got a couple of questions from the everydayers to round out this show. The first is from Fausto, who asks, what do you think, or what have you heard will be the split for Bazelak and Daniels? I have not heard anything, but my assumption is if Browning doesn't play, that it'll be Bazelak in the first half, Daniels in the second. If Browning does play, I would expect him to get the first quarter. Bazelak gets the second quarter and maybe part of the third quarter, and then Daniels the rest of the way. I think it'll also depend on situations as well as how Bazelak has performed up to that point. If Bowles and Robinson like what they see from him, or on the flip side, they really don't like what they've seen from him, they might put Daniels in at the end of the second quarter for maybe a 2-minute drill type of situation, if that opportunity presents itself, so that he can get a little bit of a feel for the NFL in terms of playing, then going to halftime, then having to get back out there and kickstart everything up again. More than likely, though, they'll just divide the game in half for the two quarterbacks, and then that'll be that. William asks, Jets starters tomorrow versus the Bucs backups. Your thoughts? Yeah, I mean, the Jets have more work to do. I think is the biggest thing here. They have a new quarterback in the offense. They definitely have more questions surrounding their personnel. They have more starting jobs up for grabs. The Bucs starters are mostly set. They're definitely way more set than the Jets are. Now, I know the initial unofficial first depth chart, you had stuff like Servassier Dennis is the starter over Josiah Trotter, but I think that changes by the time the season starts. Trot is probably going to get some playing time in this game. I do think he winds up being the week one starter next to Alex Anzalone. Ted Hurst is going to get tons of time. He won't exactly be a starter, but he'll be, heavily involved in the offense. You'll have Aiden Garnes and Keontae Scott getting lots of time in this game, and either one of them could wind up being a starter, especially if Morrison doesn't get healthy soon. So while the Bucs aren't playing any starters per se, or very few starters, there are guys that you are going to see on the field Friday that will wind up being starters or heavily utilized players by the time we get to that week one game in Cincinnati to take on the Bengals. Tom says, there is part of me that thinks they will put Morrison on PUP just to get Garnes and Pepe on the roster. Josh Hayes may not make it, even though he is good on special teams. I think it's way too early for PUP talk for Morrison. Now, if you want my full thoughts on Benjamin Morrison, go back to Monday's episode. I did a whole thing about his injury and all of that stuff. He was back and working on Wednesday. He was in full pads. He was doing the warm-ups. He was doing the individual drills. We're likely not going to see him on the field Friday. I don't think he's ready for that. I don't think Bowles would put him in a position where he hasn't done any team drills and they're just going to throw him out there in a preseason game. That said, he is getting closer. Now, if he re-aggravates this hamstring injury or we get into next week and he's still bouncing back and forth between not participating and then only doing warm-ups and individual drills, then that conversation might need to happen. We'll start to break down, the ramifications of him still not being ready going into the 4th week of training camp, heading into the 2nd preseason game. Pepe Williams has looked decent. I'm not sure he's looked good enough to usurp Hayes quite yet. Garnes, I think, will get a roster spot. Unless he goes out there Friday night and completely lays an egg and he gets worked up and down the field, I think he's already done more than enough to be considered one of the top 53 players on this roster. Now, I would have to sit down and really go through it. I will in a couple of weeks, just not at this stage where, I'll lay out my roster prediction and present it to you guys and I'll figure out how many players there are that the Bucs can legitimately keep from each position group. Because I think at this stage, the only way that Garnes doesn't make it is if they opt for more depth in the trenches and or are keeping a 7th receiver. That said, Garnes could also completely torpedo his opportunity if he plays as poorly the next couple of weeks as, he played well the first couple. Williams will likely be a practice squad kind of guy. Then you have some receivers like Patterson and Houston. They could wind up on the practice squad. You have Billy Schrauth dealing with an injury. I haven't seen any kind of update whatsoever. Haven't heard a peep about him since I saw him last week with that brace on his leg. But if he's injured and it's a significant long term, he's a guy you could see wind up on the PUP. That would potentially free up a roster spot. You would assume that they would use that on another offensive lineman, but not necessarily. So that's kind of the avenue I see for Williams. But I think Josh Hayes is still well enough ahead in that competition that Williams is going to wind up more of a practice squad guy. Still lots of time left, before the Bucs have to make that kind of decision. So things can definitely change. But that's kind of how I see it shaking out right now. But yeah, back to your original point, I just think PUP list for Morrison is a long shot at this point of training camp, but we can certainly revisit in the coming weeks if, things don't progress the way that they need to. That is going to do it for this episode. Coming up tomorrow, I will give you the who and the what to watch for during the first preseason game, because there is a way to watch the preseason if you want to gain information and it has absolutely nothing to do with what the final score ends up being. In the meantime, please check out everything going on Twitter at Locked On Bucs, at @JYarcho_Bucs, Instagram and TikTok at Locked On Bucs. In both of those places, subscribe on YouTube with the notifications turned on. That way, when the squad show goes live for the immediate reaction to the preseason game. Subscribe wherever you get podcasts. Join the Everydayer Club. You can click the link in the show notes or go to lockedonbucs.supercast.com. You want to support the show, but you don't want to join the Everydayer Club. It's really simple. Like this episode on YouTube, leave a 5-star review wherever you get podcasts. It does help other Buccaneers fans find the show. Hope you all have an absolutely outstanding day. Stay safe, stay healthy, fire the cannons. I want to thank you so much for joining me right here on Locked On Bucs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.